This week on the Afterwords podcast, best-selling author Michael Lewis talks about his new book, Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service. Drawing from a series he began for the Washington Post, Mr. Lewis highlights the dedication of federal employees and the often overlooked impact of their work. Joining him is Professor Elizabeth Linos of the Harvard Kennedy School's Public Policy and Management program. She has done research on how to improve government by focusing on its people and the services they deliver. The interview starts right after this. A note, we are taking a break for the next few weeks. During that break, we will be posting some episodes from our Afterwords archives.
I'm thrilled to be here to have a conversation with Michael Lewis about his new book. Michael, thank you so much for joining this.
Well, thanks for taking the time.
So the book is a series of essays that each highlights a different public servant that works in a different part of the U.S. government. Some of those public servants are working in agencies that many Americans will have heard of, like the IRS and the Department of Justice. Others are somewhat less visible, potentially, to most Americans, like people working at the National Cemetery Administration or the National Archives. Just to get us started, can you walk us through how you and your co-authors decided who to highlight and where you found these specific public servants for these cases?
So I have to give you some backstory because this collection didn't come just out of the blue. I had written a book during the first Trump administration called The Fifth Risk. It was about, and it was triggered by the Trump administration not wanting to participate in the transition. And it got me interested in the government, just the functions of government. And I went and sort of did my own transition and wrote about the agencies. And, agencies that people don't pay that much attention to: agriculture, commerce, energy, for example. And in the course of doing that, I was just shocked as a writer by the quality of the people, and not just as employees of government, but as characters, because they didn't think of themselves as characters. And I thought, if I were ever going to come back to this subject, I would focus more deeply on the people in government, because they just don't get the governing class, the civil servants, don't get that kind of attention, unlike the politicians. So together with the Washington Post opinion editor, David Shipley, I set out a year and a half ago to do this. And then I thought, it would be fun if we had some company and it wasn't just me. So we had different perspectives on this. And we hired six of my favorite writers, 6 writers I just love, and we can get into who they are. All we said to the writers and to me, and I said to myself, was go anywhere you want in the federal government. Tell any story you want to tell, but make it about the government, not about the politics. Make it about what this enterprise called the federal bureaucracy is doing. And each writer had a different approach to finding a story. I'm going to give you an example. Geraldine Brooks, the well-known novelist, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, but a wonderful journalist too. Geraldine said to me, this is a no-brainer. I'm going to go to the place in the government that people hate the most. I'm going to go to the Internal Revenue Service and find a story there. Yeah. And she went to the top of the Internal Revenue Service and spoke to the commissioner, just asked him to kind of let her loose in the place. And she found the story she told. It was as quixotic as that. And everybody had their own kind of approach to finding the story. But the big point is, it took everybody about 5 minutes to find a fabulous story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very clear in just the depth of these stories, but also it's funny that you use the word characters. There's so much kind of interesting information about each of the backgrounds of the public servants. And since you mentioned Geraldine, I just want to read one of the quotes from her chapter about Jared Koopman, who works, as you said, at the IRS. And she says, in my trade, meaning, in fiction writing, it would be considered malpractice to make up Jared Koopman. You just do not give your protagonist a set of attributes that includes black belts, vintage trucks, sommelier certificates, tattooed biceps, a wholesome all-American rural family, and a deeply consequential yet uncelebrated and under-remunerated career in global cybercrime. So, one thing that's very clear in reading these essays is that you're making a point about how interesting and important the work of government is, and the people who work in government are interesting, and that government workers are not a monolith. as you
Yeah.
brought the essays together, were there kind of common similarities or themes that you were hoping to surface across the essays?
I didn't. The worst sort of journalism in my mind sort of rigs it up front. You think you know what you're going to say before you go find out what's going on in the world. So I didn't have I had one specific hope for the thing, but it wasn't like it didn't require putting any guiding hand on the writers to realize. And the hope was that if you had these detailed, gorgeous portraits of the people who are actually doing the work and of the work, that it would inadvertently explode the stereotype of the bureaucrat. That we live in this world where there's this political conversation that goes on with most of the people in it hurling epithets at the deep state or the bureaucracy, and accusing the enterprise of being wasteful and fraudulent and corrupt and all that, without ever pulling one of these people out of the bowels of one of these buildings and saying, like, who are you and what do you do? And the minute you do that, whatever stereotype you have in your head, it's lazy because you haven't bothered to figure out who these people are and what they're doing and like what your tax dollars are going for. Whenever you do that, whenever you get the actual person, it quickly gets more complicated. Because some of them are, just the best among us. I mean, extremely admirable, smart people who are doing things that save our lives every day and who are doing it for less money they can get paid in the private sector. And they're there because they love the mission. Their service, they're there. They really want to serve their country. So that was the one thing I thought might come out in the course of it, but we didn't force it. And people came out with, quixotic stories. John Lanchester is English, one of my favorite writers on the planet. English novelist, but also just a gem of an explainer of complicated things. Decided instead of a person, his character was gonna be the consumer price index, just like what this thing is and how it gets put together and why it's so important. But so that was the only kind of thing I thought might happen. If you with just the accretion of story, that you'd read it and you say, if you knew nothing about the government, as I once did, you'd read it and you'd say, wow, these people are different than I thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really clear across the essays. One thing I appreciate as someone who kind of studies the civil service is that you also don't, or none of the authors seem to fall into the opposite trap of typecasting every civil servant as kind of a unidimensional do-gooder who only is there to, for reasons of self-sacrifice. And so I wanted to ask you about, what this book tells us about what motivates civil servants. So you have these really interesting backgrounds. Some are, jiu-jitsu instructors. Others are former miners. You wrote a piece around Christopher Mark. And while I was reading that piece, it seemed like he was motivated by problem solving, by fixing things. Did that surprise you? Or, what do you think we can learn about what motivates public servants to put themselves in these very, very difficult, undervalued positions?
Like a lot of the characters in the book, Christopher Mark, it strikes me that if you try to complete that sentence, Christopher Mark is motivated by X. 10 different readers will have 10 different readers will have 10 different answers to that question because it's such a complicated and interesting situation. And I'd love this for the viewers to have a sense of who he is because it is so interesting. And I'll start with my preconception. I pulled him off a list of 600 nominees for some civil service award. He just randomly, I had no idea who he was, except it said Christopher Mark has solved, over the last 35 years, has solved the problem of coal mine roofs falling in on the heads of coal miners and killing and injuring them. And it's a problem that had killed 50,000 American coal miners in the last 100 years. And then it just said Christopher Mark is a former coal miner. And I had in my head, well, oh my God, there's some drama here. Like, he's probably from West Virginia. He's a coal miner. He's probably lost a relative or something in a coal mine accident. And somehow he had the wherewithal to get himself out of coal mining and into engineering to fix this, what must be a very complicated problem that I know nothing about. The actual Christopher Mark, when I get a hold of him, says, I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and my father was a professor at civil engineering, completely exploding what I had in the picture I had in my head. And it turned out, and gets to what the motivation is, and I'll answer your question more generally in one moment. But he had rebelled against his father, an engineer, who was a professor at Princeton, and his bourgeois lifestyle when he was a teenager. And the father, if you Google the father, Robert Mark, he's actually kind of famous. He was an engineer who figured out, among other things, what kept the roofs of Gothic cathedrals from falling. He became the world's expert in modeling Gothic cathedrals and figuring out like which stones were holding the thing up and which were decorative. Christopher Mark leaves Princeton, New Jersey, refuses to go to Harvard or Princeton where he could have gone, and enters the working class and winds up in a coal mine, and then winds up almost being killed by a falling roof, and then winds up leaving the coal mine, still thinking he's rebelling against his father and figuring out what keeps coal mine roofs up. And so when I get him on the phone, after about 20 minutes, he's told me this story. He says, so, that's me in a nutshell. And I said, well, wait, you rebelled against your dad, but you ended up doing what your dad does. He got very upset with me. Like, these two have nothing in common. Gothic cathedral roofs and coal mine roofs. I said, I'm sorry, but there's something going on here. So I would fill in the blank by saying Christopher Mark does what he does in part in reaction to his father, and in part because he did find this in the course of reacting against his father. He did find this problem that absorbed him so much that he spent 35 years answering the question, and the answer is very complicated and wonderful and interesting. And that once he found his problem, and I think this is true of a lot of the civil servants, and certainly a lot of the ones that are in the book, that it's a narrow technical problem that the market's not going to fix. Oddly, coal mine companies, and it's interesting why, didn't really seriously address this problem that was killing their employees. The government, it's something for the government naturally to take on. And it requires a kind of nose to the grindstone, a narrowness, a tunnel vision about it, and a constant kind of accumulation of expertise to solve the problem. And I think he eventually, yes, he gets, because when he's there, he goes to work every day thinking, I've got a mission. I'm saving people's lives. I love what I do because it's interesting. And the mission keeps me going. And I have a secure job and it pays well enough, but his mind is not on, oh, how do I make more money for myself? Or how do I become famous, or any of the other things that many Americans obsess with. His mind is like, how do I lead a meaningful life? And I think that's the subtext of all these stories, that all these people, they're such satisfying characters because they found secrets to leading a meaningful life. And it's about not making it about yourself all the time.
Yeah. And I do think it's important, and this shows up in our research as well, that these things don't have to be kind of an either or. You can really care about a meaningful life and service and also have a really interesting scientific background and want to fix problems and be really good at your job and be very technically accurate. That it's not an either or. And I think that comes out quite clearly.
You put your finger on what's so special about our federal government. It's an unbelievably ambitious enterprise that we should be proud of rather than disdainful of. That it has attacked and addressed, so many problems that no society on earth has been willing to attack and address. Putting a man on the moon is, symbolic of this. But there are all these problems, and solving them ends up benefiting us all. There's some knock-on effects that it benefits people outside the United States too. But and there are coal miners who are alive outside of the United States because of Christopher Mark's work. But it is that's right. It's the enterprise is interested, and you could see why. Yeah. If you're the kind of person who likes to develop an expertise and who likes to solve a problem, you might naturally drift towards the federal government like a filing towards a magnet, because the federal government is filled with these huge problems that need to be addressed. It sort of like becomes the bucket for where problems go that won't be solved by the market. Funny, I once wrote a long piece about, I spent quite a bit of time with President Obama when he was president, and just to write a piece about what it was like to be president. And I remember him telling me that, like, the first thing is, if you're sitting behind this desk, all the problems that find their way to you are the miserable problems, because the easy problems get solved by someone else. So you're dealing with miserable problem after miserable problem that don't have easy answers. And that's true of the president. It's also kind of true of the government. It's like that the problem is there because, the private sector didn't,
because the market didn't solve it. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I do think that's really an important question, even as we think about what it means to bring in expertise from the private sector to the public sector and vice versa. The nature of what we ask of our public servants is different. We're asking them to take on the challenges and to shoulder the difficulties that the rest of society hasn't been able to solve. And so that seems to be fundamental. One thing that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is a disconnect that I saw in some of these essays. And that's that, a lot of these public servants are passionate and really interested in celebrating the work that they do, but really don't want to get credit for the work. And so David Eggers, for example, writes about NASA. He says, this is a good moment to emphasize that no one at JPL, which is the Jet Propulsion Lab, no one I met, at least, was willing to take credit for anything. And then Casey Sepp has a great quote from a former Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs at the VA and says, joining the civil service is basically like being in the witness protection program. No one ever knows about the good you do. And so my question for you is, given the investment that you've made in The Fifth Risk and in this book and in your writing to make the invisible work of government more visible, do you think it's a problem that the public servants themselves seem to be kind of allergic to the idea of taking credit for the incredible work that they do?
There are two parts to the answer to that question. One part is the nature of the person who's attracted to the work is they're already kind of recessive characters that if they cared that much about fame and fortune, they wouldn't be there in the first place. So it attracts a person who's not so much looking for that all the time. They're looking for something else, which is quite healthy. They're looking for problems to solve. However, human beings need recognition, and in particular, recognition serves this purpose. It's feedback. It's like, oh, you're doing well, do more of that, and it's I need it when I'm writing a piece or a book. Tell me what's good, not just what's bad. You tell me what's just bad, I start to lose my sense of what has worked for you. And every business man knows that you reward your employees. You don't just punish them. But we've constructed this institution, and it's kind of slowly drifted this way over the last half century, to be primarily a recipient of punishment rather than praise. It's like you get in trouble in the civil service if you're getting attention, it's because you're getting in trouble. And so it creates this. It does a couple of things. It creates real risk aversion in the civil service, which is unfortunate because sometimes you want people taking risks. You don't want them thinking, I can't get attention. I got to do whatever I do without getting attention, because sometimes they deserve attention. A lot of times they deserve attention. And the second thing is if something great happens inside the Bureau of Mines or Chris Mark currently is the Department of Labor. He does something really great. And that it's really useful, even just as a metaphor, for the rest of government to know about it, for like not just the people right around him, but the secretary of his department, the secretary of the other departments, so they can look at it and say, how do we replicate that? Like, how do we get more of him? How do we get more of the good stuff? And if you're not highlighting the good stuff, you're not going to be able to find the patterns. You're not going to be able to say, oh, we need to do more of this. It creates a dysfunctional environment. And I think like one of the things running through all the pieces, it's a slight undercurrent, but it's louder for people who are paying some attention to the relationship between our society and our government, is God, it would be so much better if this was better run. That this is not an ideal world where the government's just, we're not saying like the government's perfectly run. What we're saying is it's attracted some remarkable people to do some remarkable things, and sometimes in spite of the structure of the system.
Right.
That the system really does need a refresh, and what part of the refresh should be like upside for the people who do great things. But let me just add one last thing to this, and I'm sorry to monologue, but this subject really interests me.
C-SPAN's Afterwords podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwords podcast.
One side effect of these characters, of having people who are doing just monumentally important work that's like saving all kinds of lives, et cetera, who've been kind of conditioned not to think of themselves as worthy of attention, not think of themselves as characters, is to make them such good literary characters. I have found through my career that if a person thinks of themselves as a character, especially if they're like a zany character, but if they're like a character and they come to me and say, I'm a character, and here's I'm a character, they're not characters. Like, it's just, it becomes very self-conscious, reality show-ish, kind of phony. These people are sincerely characters because they have been taught to suppress their character. So you got to go digging for the character. And so in a funny way, the reader gets the sense of, oh, I might be learning things about this person hasn't thought of themselves, because they don't think of themselves. So it has this, the effect of this institution being screwed up is to spin out all these great characters for someone like me to go write about.
Yeah, I certainly agree that you can see kind of identities in these public servants that they might not recognize in themselves. So, one of these stereotypes is that there's no innovation in government. And here we are looking at individual public servants who are incredibly innovative and incredibly thoughtful and creative about how they're solving problems while also being under-resourced. That's kind of the definition of an innovation, right? Of an innovator. But they don't seem to see their work that way. They see their work as, just trying to do the best they can with limited resources. And so that reframe could change not only how they see their work, but also how other people see government and the work of government. I can't help but link this to current events. And so, one of the things that I think is really clear in this book, and was also clear in The Fifth Risk, was that you are bringing to the forefront a disconnect between kind of what government is and who works in government and what government does, and this public narrative. So I wanted to focus on a couple of different areas where I see a really strong disconnect to get your thoughts. One is around this idea of efficiency and effectiveness. So many of the civil servants that are highlighted in this book talk about their work in terms of efficiency. David Eggers writes, "The scientists I met were exquisitely aware that they were spending taxpayer money, and they were determined to justify the faith put in them." Or Pamela Wright from the National Archives says, "My job is to find the most efficient and effective ways to share the records of the National Archives with the public online." Even Ronald Walters seems to be driven by KPIs, so kind of performance indicators. He wants to improve the agency's customer satisfaction index. Where do you think the disconnect lies between what appears to be kind of the day-to-day work and the stated objectives of these public servants, and how kind of a public narrative has emerged that implies that public servants have never thought about efficiency or effectiveness or performance indicators, given that that seems part and parcel of what they do every day?
This is a fantastic question and probably worthy of many PhD theses. So I'm going to spitball here irresponsibly and try to answer it, but know that after we're done, there are like 6 things I will wish I had said. But so first thing that pops to my mind is people, when they think of the federal government, can pretty quickly get to, oh, government is awful, if what they think of is like the DMV. I swear to God, smart people who live around me in Berkeley will say the federal government's awful. Look, I just went got my driver's license renewed, and it was a horrific experience. And I have to say, like, that's not the federal government. That's the state government. That's a different thing. You may have a problem with the state government. The DMV may be horrible. Indeed, it is. Every time I've dealt with it, it's horrible. But and this is a larger issue. The places where people touch the government have been under-resourced and sometimes do not do well. I mean, and I'm thinking about like renewing your passport. That's gotten better. Or your tax returns. That's gotten better too, in spite of really massive underinvestment. I need to point out that in most cases, the problem lies in the investment in the institution, that it isn't like, oh, government employees are stupid, lazy, and corrupt. It is that the IRS has been starved of resources for political reasons, that it could be much slicker and would be much slicker if we invested in it. But so that's one thing, is that the few ways that people's lives touch the government, if they have a disappointing experience, that defines their feelings about the government, and it causes them to think, oh, it's also inefficient. So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's absolutely true that while individuals inside the government have found ways to do amazing things, and teams inside the government have found ways to do amazing things, they're doing it kind of in spite of rather than because of. This, and when I say the system is broken, I think it's not their fault the system is broken. We just not as a society put a whole lot of energy into working on how this place is managed. For example, the pay structure in the government is a relic that goes back to 1949 and was devised when most of the federal workforce was just clerical. And so if you're hiring a civil engineer, you're thinking about how you pay them, and you have your options how to pay them does not take into account what a civil engineer is paid in the private sector. So it makes it very hard to bring in talent. Is coming in almost always taking a pay cut. So it makes it hard to hire talent. It is without government becoming excessively political, or making it more political. It would benefit if it was easier to fire people who weren't doing a good job. That's a little trickier than maybe it needs to be. But maybe, like, more than anything, I mean, we take for granted the way we've structured this thing. And the way we structured this thing is very top heavy with political appointees. So that, like, a new president gets elected, new administration comes in, and they have 4,500 people to appoint, many of them who need to be Senate confirmed, to run this whole enterprise. And that is many more people, and it's went much deeper into the organizations than in any other civil service in any other democracy. And so we're saying, okay, imagine it's a business. Every 4 years, some other group is going to roll in here, and most of them having no experience in these very complicated agencies, and run them. How's that going to go? You almost necessarily have lots of people who are only kind of barely qualified for the job rolling in to be bosses for a huge workforce that knows that, the boss, as well-meaning as they are, is likely to be inept as ept. And it's just like you wouldn't build it this way if it hadn't evolved into this. And so there's like a distinction you need to make in your head between the people who are actually in these jobs trying to do them and the system that holds them. And the system needs really well-meaning, thoughtful people to come in and redesign it a bit. But that's not the people who are working in its fault. And I think the miracle is how much good gets done in spite of the system.
Yeah. I think one thing to highlight from what you said is it can both be true that Americans deserve and have the right to expect more from their government, and that this isn't really a question of efficiency, but really of underinvestment. So when we talk about efficiency, What we mean is, how well are you using the resources that have been given to you to accomplish a goal? So people see a goal that they don't like, or an outcome that they don't like, and they think it's about, misuse of resources, when in reality, what you highlight is that maybe, all of these public servants are so under-resourced, and we've underinvested in these agencies so much that the outcomes that we're seeing are not because of inefficiencies, but just a lack of resources to begin with. And that seems to be furthered with a narrative that suggests that people aren't using resources
My
correctly.
sense,
But I want to, go ahead.
Okay,
No,
I
go
was
ahead,
just going to say that, like, I've never run a huge institution, and it is its own talent. People who have that talent, I really admire, these great administrators. But I would think a great administrator from the private sector, someone who has managed a happy, stable, big company, for example, would come in and say, I'm not saying we need to spend more money on government. This is like, we need to expand this ever expanding pie. It's sort of like, I'm saying that if you spent more money on the people who are trying to do the government, you'd spend less money on government. That you'd save yourself a lot of trouble if you just invested in the mechanism. And so that I think you get a lot more out of it if you put a little more into it. And I think, like, the microcosm of this is the IRS. It's like, there are all these studies, and the numbers are all over the place, but it's like you put $1 into it, you get $5 back. There's a lot of that to be had in the government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to touch on another thing that you said, which is how we think this is going to affect talent over time. So if we think about kind of the big changes that we're seeing right now in government, or attempts to kind of change how government runs today, there's one effort that's related to efficiency or effectiveness that might not kind of incorporate some of the insights that come out of the book and come out of what you're saying. The other is thinking about just talent in terms of recruitment and retention. The last essay of the book highlights an early career professional, Olivia Reinberg-Going, who works at the Department of Justice as a paralegal in the antitrust division. And I think Olivia is kind of a hopeful case, because she is one of few young employees who have chosen to go into the federal government. The book highlights some statistics from the Partnership of Public Service that show just how few employees under 30 the federal government has. So it's about 7% compared to around 24% or so in the private sector market. So we already have this fundamental human capital crisis where we don't have enough young people entering government. One thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, how do you think current events and these stereotypes that you've talked about feed into this recruitment challenge that is already happening in government, but might get worse over the next few years?
So it's just gotten much worse, and it's gotten much worse because one of the first things the so-called Department of Government Efficiency did was to fire everybody they could fire. On that list was, I think they're called probationary employees, but they're the new hires, and the new hires are invariably young people. So they just what young people were coming into the government just got whacked. And even if the courts reverse it and say you can't do this, if you're 23 years old and you just went to work for the Forest Service and laid it all on the line and thought, this is what I want to do, and you committed to it and all the rest, how can you take seriously your employer? It's like, what is this thing I went to work for? There's got to be some trust between employer and employee. And that trust is taking a huge blow, especially with young people, because young people just bore the brunt of the first round of cuts. So that's bad. But there's always going to be the problem of, like, the public sector is never going to be able to pay what the private sector pays. So it's going to have to get its talent for other reasons. And if the message out there is this is just an unnecessary enterprise that's bloated and wasteful and corrupt, and that's it, and that's the end of the story, why would anybody leave a high-paying job to go into a low-paying job for that? Even if they knew that wasn't true, But they were going to have to live with the perception that not only are they not going to get paid, but everybody's going to think they're bloated and wasteful and corrupt. And so the the hopeful thing is the truth, because the truth is these jobs are more meaningful than any jobs in our society. You can go waste your life as an investment banker and get rich, or you can go do like as Chris Mark and all these other people that find a problem the society needs solved and solve. And it is, or you can do both. You know, you can develop skills in the private sector, but when the opportunity presents itself, move into the public sector and have huge effect. So that is the selling point of the jobs, is how important they actually are. It's how meaningful they actually are. And I've heard this for time and again. I've heard this from people who came out of very high paying jobs in the private sector into the government and stuck for much longer than they thought. They got there. One, they're shocked by the caliber of people they're working with. Two, they're shocked by the gravity of the problems they're dealing with. And it's like, they have the feeling, I owe it to my country to stay and do this well. That feeling is a great feeling. Like you're needed. And so that feeling of being needed in a really important place, I think, is what might bail us out. It's like what might continue to attract talented young people to the place.
Yeah. And I think you can kind of see the visible impact of your work in different ways, but whether it's at the federal government or state and local government, it's always surprising to me to hear these stories of public servants who say, I was only going to come in for a little bit, and then I fell in love with the work, or I realized how important it was, or I saw that I could make kind of a systemic level difference as opposed to kind of a small scale difference in my community, and really thought about kind of long-term or larger scale impact. And that really keeps them going for a long time. But as you note, if kind of the general public doesn't see it that way, it's really hard to make sure that all of that talent that could go to government ends up even applying, let alone staying in government. One thing that you say in your introduction that I want to ask you about, you say, my own ambition for the Post series in this book was that they would subvert the stereotype of the civil servant. The typecasting has always been lazy and stupid, but increasingly it's deadly. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by deadly?
Yes. So the stereotype, what I meant was the stereotype is that people weren't lazy and stupid. The stereotype itself was lazy and stupid. It was lazy and stupid for us to allow ourselves to think that these people are like trivial or bad. But the deadly part is when you think about what the government does. I mean, there are different ways to frame it, but one way I have framed it in my mind that is useful, captures much of what the government does, is manage risk. It's managing a lot of really terrifying risks, and obvious ones like, I don't know, risk of nuclear bombs going off, or risks of deadly pandemics, or risks of the water not being drinkable, risks of some drug getting on the market that kills you. I mean, you can go agency by agency and find inside of each agency there's some small portfolio of risks that are big, that it's managing, that you're glad someone is managing. And that much of what it's doing, a lot of what the government is doing, is prevention. And which is why it doesn't get a lot of credit. Like when you prevent something from happening, no one ever knows what you did. But prevention is sort of like the greatest act. It's like it would be, but that's so if you degrade this mechanism for managing deadly risks, for preventing awful things from happening, you're going to get the realization of more deadly things and fewer things being prevented. The mental image I have is like we're all playing Russian roulette in a funny way. We're all moving through life with risks we don't see. And when you degrade this mechanism we have, you're essentially putting more bullets in the chamber. You're increasing the odds that a bad thing is going to happen. And that when the bad thing happens, we're not going to deal with it intelligently. And dare I say, that the pandemic, the COVID pandemic,
Mm.
is a really good example. I mean, I wrote a whole other book about that's partly about this, the premonition, which was both about the really interesting characters who created a pandemic response plan under the Bush administration, and the degradation that took place inside, especially the Centers for Disease Control, that made that plan less operational and cost lots and lots of American lives. I mean, the postmortem of this, I realize, is controversial, and people are still sorting through what to think about this. But at the very least, you can acknowledge that the first 6-8 weeks out of the gate, we did not do well compared to the rest of the world. We had a disproportionately way high number of deaths, and it was because this mechanism had been degraded. The mechanism that everybody thought was the greatest in the world, but actually we'd allowed it to rot. We'd allowed it to become very politicized.
C-SPAN's Afterwords podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwords podcast.
So that's what I mean. I mean that I think what I hate to think, but I'm not sure I don't think, is that we all need to suffer some even more deadly thing to wake up, before we wake up and realize that we need this thing to work, and that it can work. Yeah. And that it's crazy to throw up your arms in despair and say, oh, government never works. Like, leave it all to the private sector. Because although government is harder to make work than the private sector, there are things the private sector just won't do. And defending us against a pathogen is one of them. But there are lots of other things like that. So you've got to open your mind to the fact that a couple of things are true. One, it is true that there are lots of things the private sector does better. Two, there's some things the private sector just won't do. And three, there are an awful lot of things that the private sector and the public sector need to do together. And that figuring out that collaboration is interesting and important. But to just sort of to roll through life thinking, oh, government's awful, and those people who work in government are all pointless, that's deadly.
Yeah. One thing that I've seen you write about before is this idea of, at a fundamental level, government workers keep us safe. And so the opposite of that can and does cost people's lives over time. You know, one thing that I'm curious about is, let's imagine, you know, some sort of tragic event happens in the future where an underinvestment in the government or in the government workforce leads to some inspection that didn't go right, or something that goes wrong in our water and our air, or, you know, God forbid, something else. There are, as you said, two potential reactions to that. One is to say, wow, we really need to invest in our government because this is so serious and so important. We see the outcome of this tragedy as a wake-up call to really pay attention and respect the work of government once again. The alternative is that we see a terrible outcome, and that fortifies or exacerbates the stereotype that government can't function. Do you have a sense of what we could be doing as kind of a community of people who think about this, who care about this, who see some of these risks, to make sure that when it comes down to the next big event that happens, you know, whether it's a pandemic or a war or you know, a waterborne illness, that society's ready to have a conversation about what it would look like to do government better, as opposed to kind of this becoming another reinforcing example of how government can't function? Like, is there things that we can do right now to start building that story?
Who's we?
Who's we?
Me? Is it
well,
you and
that's,
me? Or is it like we, like the 350 million of us? If you tell me, I need to know who we.
Yeah, it's a good question. So let me define my sense of we. I think you are doing kind of a serious public service by writing about this and elevating these stories. You highlight in your book other players like the Partnership for Public Service that runs the SAMIs and other kind of reward systems to highlight the role of government. There's people in my academic community, professors who work on public management and work with government to try to find solutions. So it's not a completely clear community of we's, but it's also not an empty canvas to start us off with. So there are, I think, people who are interested in understanding and learning and investing in the work of government and improving government. And of course, in that we is also government workers themselves. So whatever that community is, I feel like this is an important point in the nation's history where we have to decide how we elevate this topic or this argument that you've been making through your writing to a broader audience.
So there's a meta thing going on here, and I've been aware of from the very beginning that it's the power of narrative. Here, this book is a bunch of stories that are true stories. Nobody's put their finger or a thumb on the scale and tried to queer the stories to make everything seem shinier or rosier than it really is. It's completely true stories but there is that at the same time is sort of telling you that are showing you the power of story. And I don't think there's any question that the next time a really bad thing happens, there's going to be a war of narratives. And the people, whoever is in government, especially if they're Republicans, are going to be pointing at the state and blaming the state for the mismanagement, and people out of government will too. It's like, and it will degrade the government. I mean, the pandemic is a really good example of this. And there needs to be the counter narrative, like what actually happened. And so I think one thing that these stories, I was hoping that the first book I wrote about this, The Fifth Risk, which had this like surprisingly happy market reception, would lead to a lot more of that kind of storytelling. And one of the reasons I came back to it was it didn't. I don't quite know why. It's a mystery to me. I mean, I have some possible explanations, but it's like just so surprising to me. So, but that's in my own narrow little field. For the society generally, I mean, this is going to sound airy-fairy, but I think this is true. We need better citizens. I mean, at bottom, the government is expression of the quality of the citizens. Now, the citizens are always operating in a kind of screwed up environment, in a way the citizens are in the same position as the actual civil servants. You got to do your best in a difficult situation. But part of doing your best is education. And I think, I mean, I don't know if it's, I mean, we're never going to get like compulsory civics lessons in classes, but a push from teachers to teach kids what the government does in a very nonpartisan way. This is just like what it does. This is what it's done. This is what happens if you don't have it. Would be very useful. I mean, and I'm actually, I don't know, that's not happening, but that's something that I know that my son, who's graduating from high school, is graduating, even with me as his dad, less of a sense of what his federal government does than I did growing up in New Orleans, Louisiana in the 70s. So something's happened. And that's something I think I'm not sure who we is, need to address. It's like that once you get to a certain age, your mind doesn't change. And it's hard, your head gets rock hard, and it's harder to get stuff inside of it. But kids can learn. And that addressing that piece of it, I think would be useful. And just kind of creating the notion of what, like the idea again of what is a citizen? Like what are the responsibilities of the citizen? And one responsibility, a basic responsibility, is just to understand how your society functions, I think. And it's not okay to just have this rock-headed view of the federal government. It's not okay to wander through the world with this bigotry towards people who are public servants just trying to do their best. And I do have like one heuristic here that I would love to infect the electorate with. And it's, if you hear a politician bashing the government, just kind of mindlessly with phrases like bureaucrats, deep state, that kind of stuff, that is a sign you should not vote for them. It's what you want to hear from people who are running for office is there are problems here and we can fix them, and here's some thoughts about how to fix them. It's not, oh, the government's awful. Because in the end, you're sending those people to run the government. How good are they going to be if they're just always bad-mouthing? They've got to understand it and be constructive about it. And I would love it to be kind of an idea at large that it's a sign of a rat, that they do that. It's just like it's a tell. To tell, like when someone starts a phrase, to be honest with you, or frankly, you know, whatever happens after is probably not terribly honest or frank. And that it's like, if you're leading with hostility to the enterprise you're meant to be running or helping to run, it's a very, very bad sign. That doesn't mean you have to be pro big government. What you want is to know that what the government is doing, it's going to do well. And the arguments should all be about what the government is doing. You know, maybe we shouldn't be engaged in trying to prevent people from starving. Maybe we shouldn't have those programs. Let's have that conversation. But once we've had the conversation and we agree that it should be doing this, generally, the focus should be on how we do it well. So I don't know, those are random thoughts. This is a big question, and I obviously don't have the solution all by myself.
Well, I heard a couple of, I think, really interesting potential solutions. One is to identify this as a tell. I just think that's such an interesting idea. And, you know, the evidence supports what you're saying. So there's no organization in the world, whether it's private sector or public sector or a nonprofit, that builds employee productivity and performance and morale with leadership that is constantly telling employees that they are terrible and dishonest and lazy and bad for the world. And so there's a fundamental question here about how the choices of leadership affect employee morale and ultimately performance. But the other thing that I think is backed by evidence from the arguments you made is this idea of operational transparency. So there's a big academic literature that says if you make what government is doing more transparent to people, if you show clearly what's happening on the back end or in the background before a service is delivered, that really builds trust. And so if what we're missing here as a society is a sense of trust that government can do anything, both in terms of competence, but also in terms of ethics or benevolence, maybe what you're doing in your book and in your writing and what the other essays in the book are doing is building a sense of operational transparency about what government does in a way that can build trust over time. And so I want to thank you for that.
Very interesting way to put it. It's a very interesting way to put it. And to frame it in another way is that the government, as opposed to the politicians, but the people who are doing the governing work, the civil servants, they not only are not good at not promoting themselves, they're not allowed to promote what they do. And so, you know, every now and then you'll see a sign on the highway that says this new highway is paid for by your tax dollars. Good. But, you know, when the Department of Agriculture goes into rural Mississippi and builds a fire station, the local politicians will say, please don't say this is from the federal government because it just upsets everybody. And the Department of Agriculture will step aside and not tell people where this firehouse came from. And I think it would be useful if our government, in moderation, was able to celebrate what it's doing, or even just explain what it's doing, so people knew where their top tax dollars were going. I mean, there are things we just take for granted that a lot of other people in other parts of the world do not. I mean, it's a kind of miracle that I can walk over here to my bathroom and turn on a tap and drink the water and not be terrified it's going to kill me. And that water is coming from a reservoir 400 miles from here. It all works. And I don't even think about it. There's an awful lot that I don't think about, that I have the government, our government, which we should be proud of because it's ours. It's not this other thing. I have our government to thank for. But I don't think to thank it. And I think that's the thing we need a bit more of, is an awareness of what we should thank it for, in addition to what we should criticize it for.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place for us to end this interview. I'm so grateful for the work that you've done and for this collection of essays. It's certainly a starting point, if not a continuation, of a bigger effort to make what government does clear and make who government is clear to a much wider range of people. So I can't imagine a better time for this book to come out. It's so relevant to everything that's happening in the news. And I look forward to more people reading it as soon as it's out. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for taking an interest in it.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwords podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.